Title: The Strings of Fate. Chapter 1: The Stranger's Proposition. Ethan Turner had always believed in the elegance of simplicity, the beauty of equations, and the quiet, controlled order of the universe. His life was defined by the logical precision of quantum mechanics, the kind of rigid beauty that could be quantified, measured, and understood. But in the realm of the unknown, there were no such guarantees. The lecture hall buzzed with murmurs, the flickering overhead lights casting long shadows across the rows of chairs. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the dull hum of exhausted minds. Ethan adjusted his glasses and shuffled his papers, preparing to leave, as the last question from the audience hung in the air, a simple inquiry about the multiverse theory. It was an unremarkable question, one that had been asked 1,000 times before, but this time, something felt different. A tall man approached the stage as the session ended, his footsteps purposeful, his gaze sharp. Ethan didn't notice him at first, too focused on packing his notes into a worn leather briefcase. But then, the man's voice broke through the murmur of the crowd. "You don't believe in the strings, do you?" The question was soft but insistent, spoken as if it were both a challenge and an invitation. Ethan looked up, his gaze meeting the stranger's. The man was tall, dressed in a dark, tailored suit, his face sharp and angular, eyes gleaming with a strange intensity. There was something unsettling about him, like the air around him was charged, as if every word he spoke resonated in ways Ethan couldn't quite comprehend. His name, Ethan would later learn, was Dr. Julian Voss. "I'm sorry," Ethan replied, uncertain whether he had heard correctly. Dr. Voss smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. There was a darkness lurking beneath it, a hint of something ancient and knowing. "The strings," Voss repeated. "The threads that bind reality. You, like the rest of them, refuse to acknowledge what's staring you in the face. But the strings are real, Dr. Turner. They hold everything together. You can feel them, can't you?" Ethan furrowed his brow, feeling an odd mixture of annoyance and curiosity. "The multiverse theory, you mean?" he asked, trying to steer the conversation back to familiar ground. Voss shook his head slowly, his smile growing wider. "Not just the multiverse, Dr. Turner. Everything. Every particle. Every choice. Every action. It's all connected. It's all woven together by invisible threads, strings that stretch across time and space. You've only scratched the surface of what's possible." Ethan blinked, his scientific mind instinctively rebelling. "I'm sorry, but I'm not sure I follow. Are you saying you have some new theory on quantum mechanics?" Voss leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "No, Dr. Turner. I'm telling you that I've found the strings. And more importantly, I've learned how to manipulate them." For a moment, the room seemed to grow colder, the chatter from the other attendees fading into the background. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. This man wasn't speaking in abstract terms. He spoke with a confidence that bordered on madness, his eyes gleaming with a certainty that unsettled Ethan to the core. "You're talking about altering reality," Ethan said, his voice uncertain but growing more intrigued. "Changing the laws of physics, bending time, space." "Precisely," Voss interrupted, his gaze never leaving Ethan's. "Imagine a world where every decision, every action is yours to control. A place where the fabric of reality is malleable, where you can pull on the strings and rewrite the future." Ethan felt a shiver crawl down his spine. The way Voss spoke, so matter-of-factly, made the impossible sound plausible. He wanted to laugh it off, dismiss the man as a madman, but something in the stranger's presence made that impossible. There was a tangible weight to his words, a force that seemed to draw Ethan in, pulling him closer to the abyss of the unknown. "I can show you," Voss said, as though reading Ethan's thoughts. "I can show you how to see the strings. You'll understand, you'll feel them." Ethan hesitated. He had spent his entire career dedicated to understanding the universe through logic, through equations and experiments. But there was something about Voss's words that tugged at the edges of his mind, something that made him wonder if there was more to reality than he had ever imagined. Voss stepped back, his hands clasped behind his back. "Come with me," he said, his tone now almost hypnotic. "I'll show you the machine, the one that can bring your theories to life, the one that will prove everything." Ethan's stomach twisted. He didn't know why, but he felt compelled to follow. Maybe it was the allure of the unknown, the promise of unlocking secrets that had eluded mankind for centuries. Or maybe it was something darker, something buried deep within him, that whispered that this encounter was fated. Without fully understanding why, Ethan nodded. "All right," he said, the words slipping from his lips before he could stop it. "Show me." Voss's smile widened, his eyes gleaming. "Excellent," he said, his voice low and almost reverent. "I knew you'd understand." They walked in silence for what seemed like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. The streets outside the university were deserted, the evening air thick with the damp chill of early autumn. The city, with its dull hum of traffic and distant chatter, seemed distant and irrelevant as they made their way down an alleyway, away from the warmth of the lecture hall. Ethan's mind raced as he followed Voss through the maze of streets. What had he just agreed to? He had no idea who this man was or what he was offering, but he couldn't deny the pull of curiosity, the overwhelming need to understand what was being promised. The alleyway opened into a neglected part of the city, where old warehouses stood abandoned and crumbling. There was a heaviness in the air here, a sense of age and decay, as if the very ground was saturated with forgotten history. Voss led him to a particularly dilapidated building, the windows dark and shattered, the door hanging loosely on its hinges. The place looked like it had been abandoned for years, and yet Voss moved with an air of familiarity, as if he had been here countless times before. He pushed the door open with a creak, the sound of old wood groaning in protest. The interior was bathed in shadow, the dim light from the street lamp outside offering only a faint glow. Ethan stepped inside, his footsteps muffled by the dust that covered the floor. "Wait here," Voss instructed, disappearing into the darkness. The faint sound of metal scraping against metal echoed through the building, followed by a low hum that sent a ripple of unease through Ethan's chest. He could hear the sound of something heavy moving, something mechanical. A moment later, Voss returned, his face glowing with a strange anticipation. "It's ready," he said, motioning for Ethan to follow him deeper into the building. They entered a large, open room at the back of the warehouse, where the flickering lights revealed a bizarre sight, a machine unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. It was massive, its frame a tangled web of wires, gears, and pulsing lights. The machine seemed to breathe, its hum resonating in Ethan's bones, sending chills up his spine. "This," Voss said, stepping toward the machine with reverence, "is the key to everything. It is the device that will allow us to manipulate the strings of the universe. Once you understand how it works, you'll never look at the world the same way again." Ethan swallowed hard, his mind racing. There was no turning back now. The questions that had plagued him for years, about the nature of reality, the limits of human knowledge, were suddenly within reach. And yet, as he stood there, before the machine that promised to unravel the very fabric of existence, a sense of dread settled deep in his chest. Voss turned to face him, his smile now something far darker, something that hinted at the depths of the madness they were about to dive into. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. Ethan nodded, though a part of him wanted to run, to escape the grip of this nightmare before it consumed him. But it was too late. The strings had already begun to pull. Chapter 1. The Stranger's Proposition. Continued. Ethan's pulse quickened as he stepped closer to the machine. Its presence was overwhelming, as if the very air around it was charged with a strange and sinister energy. The tangled mess of wires and coils seemed to hum with a rhythm that matched the beat of his heart, and the faint blue light flickering from within the machine made his skin crawl. "Don't be afraid," Dr. Voss said, his voice a strange blend of encouragement and amusement. His words sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. "This is where it begins. You'll see. You'll understand." Ethan's mind raced, questions and doubts swirling in his head, but his body seemed to move of its own accord. He couldn't tear his gaze away from the machine. It was as if something was pulling him, drawing him toward it with an irresistible force. "What is it?" Ethan asked, his voice hoarse, the words catching in his throat. He wasn't sure if he was speaking to Voss or to the machine itself, as though the device held the answers to all his burning questions. "This," Voss said, stepping to one side, gesturing grandly toward the monstrous device, "is the Nexus. It is a machine designed to manipulate the fundamental threads of reality, to alter the very fabric of existence itself. You've heard of string theory, yes? Ethan nodded automatically. String theory was a cornerstone of modern physics, the theory that proposed that the universe was not made of individual particles, but of tiny vibrating strings that existed in multiple dimensions. It was elegant, profound, an idea that could explain everything from gravity to the most bizarre phenomena of quantum mechanics. But, as far as he knew, it was purely theoretical. Nothing like this had ever existed in the real world. Voss seemed to read his mind. I know what you're thinking. This is beyond the realm of your equations, your theories. But that's the beauty of it, Dr. Turner. You're no longer confined to the limitations of the physical world. Once you learn how to see the strings, really see them, you'll understand that the universe isn't just a collection of random events. It's a delicate web of interwoven possibilities. The hairs on the back of Ethan's neck stood up as the weight of Voss's words settled into his mind. See the strings. Manipulate reality. It sounded insane. A madman's ramblings, something pulled from the pages of a science fiction novel. And yet, there was an undeniable pull to it. The possibility of understanding the universe in a way no one else ever could. The temptation was too great to resist. Voss stepped forward and placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, his grip firm but not unpleasant. I've been waiting for someone like you, he said, his voice low and almost conspiratorial. Someone who is willing to look beyond the veil, to understand the true nature of existence. But it comes at a price, Dr. Turner. Ethan met his gaze, his brow furrowing. A price. His heart beat faster, though whether from fear or excitement, he couldn't tell. The strings are delicate, Voss continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. They can be pulled, stretched, or even broken, but every action has consequences. You can't change reality without leaving a mark. You must be careful, Dr. Turner. The strings are fragile, and the more you tamper with them, the more you risk unraveling everything. For the first time since he'd met Voss, Ethan felt a chill of doubt creep into his mind. The implications of what Voss was saying were profound, dangerous even. Could they really control the fundamental forces of reality? Could they reshape the universe itself? And what would be the cost of such power? Are you telling me that you've already done this? Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. He felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though the ground beneath his feet was starting to tremble. Voss's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't one of reassurance. It was a smile tinged with something darker. Oh yes, I've seen the strings. I've altered them, and I've paid the price. Ethan swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in his throat. The unease was now an undeniable presence, pressing down on him, suffocating him. What had Voss done? And what price had he paid? Look, Voss said suddenly, as if reading Ethan's thoughts. He motioned for him to come closer, gesturing toward the heart of the machine. The hum grew louder, more intense, and the blue lights flickered again. I will show you just once. After this you can decide. But I warn you, once you understand how the strings work, there's no going back. Ethan hesitated. His mind was torn between fear and an overwhelming curiosity. He had always wanted to know the truth, the deepest secrets of the universe. This was the opportunity of a lifetime, something no physicist, no human being had ever experienced. He took a deep breath and stepped closer to the machine, his heart pounding in his chest. Voss placed a hand on his arm, guiding him toward a console covered in buttons, switches, and screens that flickered with strange symbols. The machine seemed to pulse, as if it were alive, its power emanating from within. Activate it, Voss said, his voice trembling with excitement. You do it. You pull the first thread. Ethan's fingers hovered over the console, his mind racing with the implications of what he was about to do. Could he really alter reality? Could he truly bend the fabric of the universe to his will? There was only one way to find out. With a steadying breath, Ethan pressed a button. Instantly, the machine came to life. The lights grew brighter, the hum intensifying. Ethan felt the hairs on his neck stand up as a strange force seemed to push against him. He looked down at the console, watching as the screens flashed with impossible equations, formulas that seemed to defy logic itself. Then it happened. The world around him seemed to warp. The walls of the warehouse flickered, as if the very space itself were being stretched and torn. The air crackled with an electric energy, and for a brief moment, Ethan thought he could hear something. A voice, a whisper, like the sound of 1,000 strings being plucked at once. "Do you see it?" Voss asked, his voice trembling with excitement. His eyes were wide, almost feverish. Ethan stared at the screens, his mind racing to comprehend what he was seeing. The equations on the screen began to rearrange themselves, shifting in ways that defied all understanding. It was as if the very fabric of space and time was unraveling before his eyes. But then, something changed. The machine began to sputter and crack. The lights flickered violently, casting erratic shadows across the room. The air grew thick, oppressive, as if the very atmosphere were being distorted by the machine's power. Ethan's heart raced as he stepped back, fear gripping him in a cold iron fist. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice rising in panic. Voss seemed unperturbed. He was staring at the machine, his eyes wide with something akin to wonder. "It's working. You've done it, Dr. Turner. You've pulled the first string." The walls around them began to warp, twisting and stretching, the very space itself beginning to break apart. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, moving as if they had a life of their own. The machine whined, its hum growing louder, more frantic. And then, with a deafening crack, the power surged. Ethan felt a sudden wave of nausea hit him, and for a moment, the room spun out of control. He stumbled backward, his vision blurring as reality itself seemed to buckle under the pressure of the machine's unnatural power. Then, just as suddenly, everything stopped. The room fell silent. The hum of the machine faded to nothing, and the warped walls snapped back into place. The lights flickered one last time and then settled into a dull glow. Ethan stood there, his body trembling, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Was it real? Had the fabric of reality truly been bent? He looked at Voss, whose face was alight with a manic joy. "You've done it," Voss repeated. "You've seen the strings." Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His thoughts were a tangled mess of confusion and fear. What had they done? What had they unleashed? "Now," Voss said, his voice lowering to a whisper, "the real work begins. Welcome to the true nature of reality, Dr. Turner. The strings are yours to command." But as the words left his mouth, something in the room shifted, a cold presence creeping over them both. Ethan felt it, a darkness that lingered in the corners of the room, watching, waiting, and for the first time, he understood that some strings should never be pulled. Chapter 2. The Price of Knowledge. Ethan's mind raced, the events of the past few moments swirling in his thoughts like a whirlpool. The machine, the equations, the strange warping of reality. It was all too much to grasp. His hands shook as he reached for the nearest table, steadying himself. A cold sweat coated his skin, and his breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. Voss stood behind him, silent now, as though waiting for something. Ethan could feel the doctor's presence, the weight of his gaze pressing down on him. The machine hummed softly in the background, its rhythmic pulse like the heartbeat of some great, alien creature. You said we'd see the strings," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking louder might cause the fragile reality around him to shatter. "I saw something. The equations, the walls, they all—" He paused, struggling to find the right words. "What just happened? What did we do?" Voss didn't immediately respond. Instead, he circled around Ethan slowly, his eyes fixed on the machine with a quiet intensity. There was something almost reverential in the way he looked at it, as though he were standing in front of a god, or perhaps a devil. "I told you," Voss said finally, his voice measured, almost too calm. "You've touched the first thread. You've altered the very nature of reality. Do you understand what that means, Dr. Turner?" Ethan shook his head, his mind still clouded. The world felt strange, wrong even. The walls of the warehouse seemed slightly off-center, the shadows too deep, the light too harsh. His body felt unsteady, as if gravity itself were shifting in subtle, imperceptible ways. And yet, there was an undeniable thrill running through him. He had just glimpsed something beyond the veil, something that no one else had ever seen. But with that exhilaration came fear. What had they done? Did we break something? Ethan asked, his voice hoarse now. Is reality? Is it unstable? We didn't... He cut himself off, the words too terrifying to say aloud. Voss looked at him, a slight smile curling at the corner of his lips. Break something? No, we've bent it, touched it, but not in a way that will destroy it. Not yet. Not yet. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Ethan stepped away from the table, the growing unease within him pushing him to move. He wanted to escape, to run. But his curiosity anchored him to the spot, unwilling to let go of the enigma before him. What do you mean, not yet? Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. What happens next? Voss's eyes sparkled with something dark and dangerous. What happens next, Dr. Turner, is that you understand the true cost of this knowledge. You've taken the first step into a world that most people couldn't even begin to comprehend. But knowledge comes with a price. Always. The words echoed in Ethan's mind, filling him with a growing dread. He wanted to ask more, wanted to demand answers. But something about Voss's tone made him hesitate. What price? Ethan's voice trembled now, the weight of the situation pressing in on him. What's the cost of seeing these strings? Voss didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned toward the machine once more, his gaze distant, as if lost in thought. The humming of the machine grew louder, as if reacting to the conversation, or perhaps to something else altogether. It felt like a living thing, pulsing with an awareness of its own. The strings are delicate, Voss finally said, his voice lowering. The more you pull, the more you stretch, the more unstable they become. The more you play with reality, the more you risk damaging it. And when that happens, there are consequences. Subtle at first, yes, but eventually they will catch up with you. The universe will fight back. Ethan swallowed hard. What do you mean, the universe will fight back? Voss turned his gaze back to him, a sharp gleam in his eyes. You're not the first one to pull at the strings. I wasn't the first. There were others before us, Dr. Turner. They sought to understand, just as you do. But they didn't understand the price they would pay. They broke the rules. They tampered with things they shouldn't have. Ethan's mind raced, his thoughts tumbling over each other. The warning was clear now, as was the sense of impending doom that seemed to hang in the air. But there was something more, something that gnawed at him, something in the way Voss spoke, something that felt like the echo of a forgotten truth. What happened to them? Ethan asked, his voice barely audible. Voss smiled grimly. They paid the price. Some disappeared entirely, vanished without a trace. Others, their minds fractured, their perceptions of reality twisted beyond repair. They saw things that weren't supposed to be seen, felt things that weren't meant to be felt. A shiver ran down Ethan's spine. The idea of losing himself, of vanishing, it was too much to comprehend. But as Voss spoke, he couldn't help but feel that the warning wasn't just for others. It was for him too. The weight of the machine, of the knowledge, pressed down on him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the world around him was beginning to warp once more. The hum of the machine increased in intensity, almost as though it were feeding off his rising anxiety. His pulse quickened as the walls seemed to shift again, the shadows in the corners of the room creeping further toward him. The air felt thick, heavy with a strange, suffocating energy. I don't understand, Ethan said, shaking his head. I don't understand what you want from me. Why am I here? Why show me this? Voss's expression softened, his eyes clouding for a brief moment, as though he were remembering something long buried. You're here because you're capable. You're the one who can see what others cannot. You're the one who can understand the strings. And that is why you're here, Dr. Turner. Ethan took a step back, his mind reeling. The air felt colder now, a creeping chill seeping into his bones. There was something wrong, something off. The shadows in the room seemed to be growing thicker, the darkness itself creeping closer. He could almost hear something, a faint whisper, like the rustling of paper, or the sound of 1,000 strings being plucked at once. What's happening? He asked, his voice trembling. Voss didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned back to the machine and began adjusting the settings on the console. The screens flickered as strange symbols danced across them, their meanings impossible to decipher. Then, with a quiet click, the machine powered down, the humming slowly fading into silence. Ethan stood frozen in place, his breath shallow and uneven. The silence in the room was oppressive, like a weight pressing down on his chest. "You should go," Voss said, his tone suddenly shifting. It was as if the warm, almost conspiratorial air had vanished, replaced by something colder, more distant. "I'll show you more later, but for now, you need to go." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he stood there, torn between the overwhelming desire to stay and understand more, and the primal instinct to flee from whatever darkness he had just glimpsed. "Is this over?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Voss gave a sharp nod. "For now. But remember, what you've seen can never be undone. You can never go back to the way things were. Not after this. Not after you've touched the strings." The words felt like a final warning, a dismissal. As Voss turned away, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow darker, more menacing, as if watching him leave. With one last look at the machine, Ethan turned and stumbled toward the exit, his mind still reeling. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and he found himself standing in the dimly lit alley once more. But nothing felt the same. The world around him seemed wrong. The air was heavy, and the city streets, usually so familiar, seemed foreign. The lights in the distance flickered unnaturally, and the sounds of the world, the hum of distant cars, the murmur of voices, sounded muffled, as though he were hearing them through a thick curtain. Ethan's hands trembled as he reached for his phone, his fingers brushing over the cracked screen. He needed to get out of there. He needed to get away from the machine, from Voss, from the terrible knowledge that had already begun to gnaw at his mind. But as he turned to leave, a cold voice echoed in his ear. "You can never escape the strings, Dr. Turner. Not now. Not ever." Ethan froze, his blood turning to ice. And somewhere, deep within the city's dark heart, the machine hummed. Chapter 3. The Fractured Path. The days following Ethan's encounter with the machine seemed to blur into one long, disjointed haze. He couldn't shake the sense of unease that clung to him like a second skin. His world had changed in ways he couldn't explain. The very fabric of reality felt thinner now, stretched taut over something darker, something he was only beginning to understand. Ethan's once clear-cut life had become a labyrinth of questions, and with each passing day, the answers seemed further out of reach. He couldn't go back to his normal life. He couldn't even return to his apartment. Every corner of his existence felt like it had been twisted, warped by the glimpse he had seen beyond the veil. The knowledge he had touched was like a poison, slowly spreading through his veins, leaving him restless, agitated, and, most disturbingly, aware of things that weren't meant to be known. The whispering voices never stopped. It was subtle at first, barely audible, like the distant rustle of leaves on an autumn wind. But soon, the voices grew louder, more insistent. They were not words, not in the traditional sense, but rather a presence, a feeling of something moving just beyond the edges of his perception. A twinge of discomfort, a flicker in his vision that wasn't there before. He had tried to ignore it at first, but it wasn't long before he began hearing the voices at night. It started when he tried to sleep, an unsettling murmur just under his breath, so faint he couldn't discern the language, but strong enough to stir something primal within him. He couldn't escape them. They were inside his mind, under his skin, tugging at the very corners of his thoughts. The shadows, too, had changed. No longer were they simple patches of darkness. They were alive, shifting and crawling across the walls of his apartment, like ink spreading through water. At first, Ethan thought he was imagining things, his mind unraveling due to the stress of the machine. But after a while, he began to understand the truth. The shadows were reflections of the fractured reality he had touched, fragments of the strings that were now tangled in his life. Every time he looked away, they seemed to shift. Every time he blinked, they seemed to grow. Something was watching him from within the shadows, something waiting. They're waiting for you. The thought, like a seed, planted itself in the back of his mind and began to grow, twisting his thoughts with its dark promises. Ethan stood at the edge of his old neighborhood, staring at the crumbling building that once held his apartment. His fingers gripped the worn-out strap of his bag, knuckles white with the strain. He hadn't been back since that night, and the urge to return, to find answers, to confront the lingering dread, gnawed at him. But there was a reason he hadn't come back. The building wasn't right anymore. It felt wrong. The familiar skyline loomed ahead, but the city now seemed like a distant memory, like a place that had ceased to exist. Every corner, every street seemed covered in a thin layer of dust, like time had stopped moving here. The streets were empty, too empty. Where are the people? He wondered, feeling the strange sensation of being watched, even though the streets were desolate. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled as he walked toward the entrance of the building, the door hanging ajar, its hinges groaning with the wind's sigh. As Ethan stepped inside, the familiar smell of old wood and stale air hit him like a wave. But there was something else, something darker that made his stomach churn, something decayed. The walls seemed to pulse, faintly, as if breathing. The air itself was thick, clinging to his skin like a wet shroud. His footsteps echoed unnaturally in the hallway, the sound bouncing off the warped walls, distorted. It was as though the building was reacting to his presence, stretching and contorting itself in a way that made him feel small, vulnerable. The elevator shaft to his floor was still there, though the rusted metal doors were now covered in cracks. As he reached out to press the button, a strange sensation crawled up his spine. The shadows beneath the elevator doors seemed to grow longer, twisting as though they were alive, reaching for him. He took a breath, steadying himself. The shadows were playing tricks on him. They had to be. The elevator creaked to life, slowly moving upward, the sound of the machinery grinding against itself making Ethan's stomach turn. He could feel the pressure in his chest building as the walls of the elevator seemed to shrink in on him, the space growing tighter with every passing second. When the elevator doors finally opened, the hallway was different. Not in any way that Ethan could articulate, but there was a definite sense of wrongness in the air, as though the entire floor had been warped by something unseen. The walls, once beige and mundane, now pulsed with an unnatural glow. The light was dim, almost sickly, casting long shadows that writhed along the floor. And then, the whispering started again. It was faint at first, a soft murmur like the hum of a faraway wind, but as Ethan stepped further into the hallway, the voices became clearer. They were more than just whispers. They were insistent now, a cacophony of overlapping sounds that seemed to echo inside his skull. The sound was deafening, like 1,000 voices calling out to him from the darkness. "Ethan, come closer." His heart skipped a beat. He froze, unable to breathe, as the voice, soft yet urgent, seemed to rise up from the very walls around him. He looked down the hall toward his old apartment door, and the shadows gathered there. It was as though the darkness itself had taken form, shifting and swirling around the edges of the doorway. "You cannot escape." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He knew it wasn't just his mind. It wasn't just his imagination. The strings, the ones he had touched, were alive, and they were calling to him. He took a tentative step forward, drawn to the doorway despite the terror that clenched his gut. It was like the door was pulling him in, beckoning him, as if he had no choice but to obey. He reached for the doorknob. The moment his fingers made contact, a shock of cold ran through his body, spreading from his hand to his heart, freezing him in place. The shadows, which had been slowly creeping across the floor, now swirled violently around his feet, like tendrils of smoke. And then the door creaked open. Inside, the apartment was dark, but not empty. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, and the walls were smeared with something that looked like dried blood. But it wasn't the state of the room that unsettled him. It was what lay beyond. The room had changed. It was still his apartment, but the proportions were wrong. The walls were too close, the ceiling too low. The floor seemed to stretch beneath his feet, becoming a vast, dark abyss that reached out like an endless ocean. The windows were blacked out, the light flickering in strange, unpredictable patterns. Shadows clung to every corner, moving like living things, breathing in time with his every exhale. And then, the voices returned. "Come inside, Ethan." He stepped forward, though his legs felt like lead, each movement slow and deliberate as if his body was refusing to obey. But his mind was compelled. Every cell in his body screamed for him to stop, but the whispers were like a siren's call, drawing him deeper into the apartment's heart. The door slammed shut behind him. The whispers grew louder. They weren't coming from the walls anymore, but from the darkness itself. The room pulsed, the shadows thickening, as though something was waiting, watching. Suddenly, the air turned colder. Ethan's breath fogged in front of him, his heart pounding as he realized that something was moving in the dark, slowly, methodically, like it was hunting him. He didn't need to look to know what it was. They are here. Chapter 4. The unraveling continued. The crack in the air was followed by an unnatural, deafening silence. Ethan's breath hung suspended in the room, thick with terror. The shadows, which had seemed so alive only moments before, paused, as if the room itself were holding its breath. The dark figure loomed before him, the flickering pulse of its presence unsettling his very core. It was as though the figure was waiting for him to comprehend, to understand the gravity of what was unfolding. And then, the room began to move. It wasn't just the shadows, the walls, solid, unmoving walls that had once offered him a sense of security, were shifting. There were no creaks, no groans of old wood or the rumblings of settling stone. It was more insidious than that. It was as if the walls themselves were distorting, stretching, growing long, sinewy veins that reached out toward him, creeping toward the very center of the room where he stood paralyzed. Ethan's legs felt like stone. He tried to move, to force himself away, but the floor beneath him was no longer solid. The cracks in the room's surface deepened and spread, spider-webbing out in all directions. They glowed with an eerie, sickly light, casting long, warped shadows over his body. The temperature plummeted, and a bitter frost began to creep along the edges of his skin, biting through his clothes. He tried to scream, but no sound came. His throat was dry, as if the very air had stolen his voice. The figure, this thing, was so close now, its form more distinct, though still misshapen. Its edges flickered in and out of existence, a distortion of reality itself, its eyes wide and unblinking, sucking in the light around it like a void. "We are all threads," it said, its voice now more like 1,000 voices layered over one another, each one sibilant, dripping with malice. "You are a thread, Ethan, and I am the needle. You've come to unravel what should never be touched." Ethan's pulse quickened. The weight of the words, of the meaning behind them, began to sink in. The strings, the machine, the strange, sickly pull he had felt ever since his encounter with the mysterious device in the attic. There was something terrible, something ancient about this place, this apartment. It wasn't just an ordinary room, an ordinary space. It was a node in something far larger, far older than he could comprehend. A web that stretched across time, across worlds perhaps. And he, now trapped within it, was a part of that web. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. "No," he whispered, his voice a broken thing, barely audible above the thrum of the darkness. "I don't understand. What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head slightly, as if it were pondering the question. Then it reached forward, slowly, deliberately, and touched the air in front of Ethan's face. The space between them seemed to bend as its hand passed through, a sickening ripple distorting everything in its wake. "It's already too late," it murmured. "The web has been woven. You, Ethan, are already a part of it. There is no going back." Ethan's heart hammered violently in his chest as the figure's words wrapped themselves around him like chains. The shadows pressed in, suffocating him, and for a moment, the world seemed to lose focus. His vision blurred, and all he could hear was the sound of his own breathing, shallow and desperate. The room started to shrink. The walls, once distant, now pressed in on him, contracting like a vice. The air grew thick with the oppressive weight of unseen forces, as though the room itself were alive and angry. He could feel it now, the pulling, the tensing of the threads that held everything together. The very fabric of reality seemed to be unspooling, the threads loosening, and Ethan, helpless, was dragged deeper into the web, the machine. He had activated the machine. But it was more than that, wasn't it? The machine wasn't just a device. It was a gateway, a catalyst, a force of nature wrapped in wires and metal, designed to tear open the boundaries between worlds. And by touching it, by activating it, Ethan had opened something terrible. The shadows in the room began to writhe more violently now. They were alive, crawling up the walls, twisting like serpents. Ethan could hear them, whispering, hissing in languages that no human ear should ever have to hear. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they were desperate for something. Then, a vision flashed in front of Ethan's eyes. It came without warning, a terrible, intrusive image that seemed to burn itself into his mind. He saw his own reflection. No, it wasn't his reflection, not quite. It was him, but different. His face was twisted, contorted, his skin pale and thin, his eyes wide, black and hollow, as though something had drained him of life. It was a version of himself that shouldn't exist, a version that had been broken, shattered by the very forces he had unleashed. "It's not just you," the voice whispered, as if reading his mind. "We all have our places in the web, and when one thread snaps, all others follow. You will see, soon." The figure took another step forward, and the shadows followed its movements, flowing like liquid darkness. The room seemed to dissolve entirely, replaced by something far more vast. Ethan felt himself falling, or was it floating? The walls and floor were gone now, and in their place was a boundless void. It was black, deeper than anything he had ever seen, and within it, he could feel the presence of something ancient, something that had waited for eons to rise. "Look," the voice urged, and as if compelled by an unseen force, Ethan looked into the abyss. What he saw made him scream. The void was not empty. It was filled with eyes, countless eyes, black and unblinking, each one staring into his soul. They glowed faintly, like dying stars, their gazes cold and indifferent. Some were large, others small, and they seemed to move, blinking, shifting, all watching him, waiting for something. Ethan felt his mind slipping. He couldn't hold on any longer. The pull was too strong. The thread had been cut. Suddenly, the eyes blinked, one by one, slowly, then all at once. And in that instant, everything changed. A crack, deep and resounding, split the air. The void began to fold in on itself, compressing, suffocating. Ethan gasped, his chest tightening. He had no words left, no thoughts. There was only the overwhelming pressure, the pull, dragging him down, deeper and deeper into the darkness. And then, with a final wrenching scream, he was gone. Chapter 5. Threads of Madness. The air was thick. It clung to Ethan like a shroud, oppressive and cold. He had no idea how long he had been gone, how long he had drifted through the void, falling through layers of consciousness that blurred and fractured as if reality itself was crumbling. Time, as he once understood it, no longer existed. There was only this endless, suffocating presence that enveloped him, consuming him. The eyes, they never left him. They were always there, blinking, watching, their black pupils unfathomable pits that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. He couldn't escape them. He could feel them burrowing into his mind, carving their way into his thoughts, his memories, into the deepest recesses of his soul. He wasn't sure where he was anymore. The void he had fallen into was neither dark nor light. It was a paradox, a place between places, a liminal space where existence itself was twisted into something alien, something malignant. The air was thick with whispers, voices that echoed without sound, yet their meaning was clear, dreadfully clear. You were part of the web now. The words felt like a curse, crawling into his ears like insects, wriggling their way into his brain. The web. It was always the web. He had become a thread, a small, fragile strand of fate caught in something far larger, something older than he could ever comprehend. And it was pulling him But pull where? The floor, or what was left of it, beneath him felt like liquid. It rippled with every step he took, the surface twisting and folding, threatening to swallow him whole. He stumbled, unable to find solid footing. A cold, unfamiliar sensation swept over him as he reached out to steady himself. His fingers brushed against something soft, like the fabric of 1,000 garments, yet it didn't feel like anything he knew. It was like skin, too smooth, too slick, too unnerving. He recoiled, but the touch lingered. It clung to him, wrapping around his wrists, his arms, his neck, tightening with every panicked breath he took. "We all are threads," the voice whispered again, slithering through his thoughts, filling the empty space with its insidious rhythm. "All of us, we are bound together. All are part of the design." Design! That word reverberated in his mind, echoing in the strange, warped space around him. Was this what he had unleashed? A design that had been waiting for him? Was this some kind of punishment for meddling with forces he could never understand? Ethan's hands shook as they scraped against the strange material. The walls around him seemed to breathe, to pulse with life, as if the very space itself were alive. And then, as his fingers slid against the slick surface, the dark material parted, revealing something even worse. A door. Not a door in the traditional sense, but an opening, as if the very fabric of the space had been torn apart, leaving a jagged, glowing rift in its wake. There was no light beyond it, only the abyss, the same endless void that had swallowed him. But the pull, the lure of it, was irresistible. His heart hammered in his chest, a frantic, erratic beat that only intensified as the rift beckoned him forward. He didn't want to go. He didn't want to step into the void again, but something inside him pushed him toward it. The whispering voice, now a chorus of hundreds, no, thousands, urged him forward. They were all here, those threads, those voices from the web, all calling to him, pulling him toward the rift. "You cannot escape what you've started," the voices cooed, hissing through the suffocating silence. "You are the key. You are the thread that binds everything together. Step through and the design will be complete." His legs trembled as he took one tentative step toward the opening. Each step felt like a betrayal, each movement taking him further from what he once understood, further into something more terrifying than anything his mind could process. And yet, as his foot crossed the threshold, the sensation of being trapped intensified. He wasn't just stepping into darkness. No, this was something different. It was as if the darkness was closing in around him, wrapping itself around him like cold, gnawing fingers. The moment his foot touched the other side, a sudden pressure slammed into his chest, knocking the wind out of him. The air itself seemed to choke him, like he had walked into a space that was too small for him to exist in. And then, it hit him. An overwhelming sense of presence. Something ancient, something that had watched for eons as threads were spun, as worlds were woven together, now saw him. It knew him. Ethan tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness, consumed by the oppressive force around him. The web, the voice was clearer now, more insistent, more triumphant. "You are not alone in the web." A figure appeared before him. It was like a shadow at first, a wisp of darkness that moved with a fluidity that defied logic. It was a figure clothed in nothing, or perhaps it was dressed in everything, cloaked in the very fabric of the web itself. But its eyes, those eyes, they were unmistakable. They were like the eyes Ethan had seen before, the eyes of the thing that had followed him since the beginning. The eyes that watched from every corner of the darkness, from the depths of his mind. They were watching him now, and they knew everything. The figure extended its hand toward him, and as it did, a strange sensation washed over Ethan. His skin felt like it was melting. His bones felt soft, like wax exposed to the heat of a fire. He staggered back, but the darkness pulled him forward. "You are not the first," the figure whispered, its voice a hollow, distant echo that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "And you will not be the last." Ethan could feel the cold on his skin, but it wasn't just the cold of the air. No, this was something deeper. It was the cold of inevitability, the cold of the web, of threads being pulled tighter, tighter, until they snapped. The floor beneath him gave way with a sickening lurch. He screamed as he fell, his body tumbling into the abyss, his limbs flailing in a desperate attempt to grasp onto something solid. But there was nothing. Nothing but the endless, yawning chasm that swallowed him whole. And then, in the distance, something else began to take form. A shape, a figure, a door. Chapter 6. The fracture continued. The darkness closed in like a slow tide, creeping beneath the cracks in Ethan's mind. For a moment, he was suspended in nothingness. No sound, no light, just the heavy press of silence, thick and suffocating. His pulse was the only thing he could hear, pounding in his ears like the beat of a dying drum. Then, slowly, the silence began to bend. A soft scraping sound, like nails on slate, filled the air. His body jerked involuntarily, his arms flailing as he struggled to understand what was happening. Was he still falling? Was he still trapped within the endless void? The world felt too dense, too real now, his senses overwhelmed by the weight of the unseen force that had followed him into this realm. The figure, the thing that had reached for him, that had whispered those words into his soul, was gone. But its presence lingered like a shadow. A coldness remained in the very air, thick with dread, like the atmosphere itself had absorbed some unholy essence. Ethan tried to push himself up, but his limbs felt like they had turned to lead, sluggish and unresponsive. The oppressive force of whatever lay around him seemed to be pulling him deeper into the folds of this place, this web. He could feel it now. It was like a pressure against his chest, a weight that pushed harder as he breathed, as though the very air were becoming too thick to inhale. His throat tightened with each desperate gasp, and the sensation of being watched, being known, grew until it became a suffocating ache in the back of his skull. Slowly, his hands began to tremble, his fingers twitching against the cold ground beneath him. The faint metallic taste of fear, sharp and bitter, coated his mouth as his eyes scanned the void, searching for something, anything, that would explain this new nightmare. That's when he saw it, a ripple. The darkness around him shifted, bending, folding in on itself as if the very fabric of the universe was being twisted by some unseen hand. It was as though the walls of reality itself were melting, folding like the edges of a paper, and then reforming into something else, something unrecognizable. The air shimmered, distorting, and through the wavy haze, Ethan saw shapes, figures, dancing just out of reach of his comprehension. At first, they were shadows, flickering in and out of existence like fragments of a broken film reel. They were moving, but not like anything natural. Their forms were indistinct, amorphous, like smoke or vapor, yet somehow solid in the way they moved, gliding smoothly through the air with purpose. Ethan's heart pounded harder, each beat feeling like it was being struck by a hammer, a relentless drumbeat that shook his insides. What were these things? Where had they come from? He had no words, no way to grasp what his eyes were trying to understand. They weren't human, weren't anything close to human, and yet they were familiar. The realization struck him like a blow to the head. They were like him, or at least, like what he had become. The figures seemed to regard him with an eerie, unblinking attention, their shifting shapes flickering with a strange awareness. And then, without warning, one of them— no, it wasn't a one, it was a collective form, a whispering, undulating presence— drew closer. It wasn't moving in the way a living thing would. It was like it was folding through space, drawing nearer with a grace that defied the laws of nature. Ethan wanted to scream, but his throat was dry, constricted, as if his body had forgotten how to make a sound. The entity came to a stop before him, and for a moment, time seemed to still. Then a voice— no, a chorus of voices, layered over each other, deep and metallic, spoke. It wasn't a voice in the traditional sense. It was something else. Something that scraped along the inside of his skull, like someone dragging their nails down the chalkboard of his mind. You should have known. Ethan flinched at the words. The whisper seemed to burrow into his bones, to echo within his chest. He wanted to ask what it meant, to demand some explanation, but he couldn't speak. His body was frozen, caught in the suffocating grip of this thing. You have crossed the threshold now, the voice continued. each word vibrating with a power that made the air crackle around him. There is no turning back. Turning back. The phrase lingered in his mind like the remnants of a bad dream. There was no turning back. He knew that instinctively now, more than ever. This place, this nightmare, this web, had already begun to thread itself into the fabric of his soul. It had always been there, waiting, and he had only just noticed it. His mind spun as he tried to grasp at something, anything, to hold on to. He searched desperately for a way out, but the walls, the air, everything felt like it was alive, pulsating, vibrating in a rhythm he could feel deep in his marrow. He tried to push himself up again, but his legs buckled beneath him, sending him tumbling to the ground. His hands scraped across the cold, rough surface as he gasped for air, but the air was thin, brittle. There was no air. "You are one of many now." The voice's words began to twist, distorting and warping into something else, something more dreadful. Each sentence felt like a blow to his senses, each one unraveling his understanding of reality, of time. His mind cracked open like an egg, and the knowledge that poured in was unbearable. He saw it now, the threads. The air was laced with them. The walls were woven with them. His skin, his very being, was connected by them, each one pulling him tighter into the tangled web of the otherworldly force that had ensnared him. He could feel them like veins beneath his skin, like tiny strands threading through the fibers of his consciousness. "We are the weavers." The voice grew clearer, the chorus of words rising as one, harmonizing into a single, terrifying truth. "We control, we create, we destroy." The realization hit him like a crushing weight. These beings, these things, weren't just part of this place, this web. They were the web. They were the architects of this universe. They had built it, woven it, and now they were watching, observing, guiding each movement like the hands of a twisted puppeteer. The web had no beginning. It had no end. It stretched infinitely, connecting every moment, every life, every death, until they were all part of the same thing, forever. And now, Ethan was part of it. There was no escaping. The ground beneath him shifted once more. A tremor ran through the web, a wave that passed through him like a shock, and then the dark figure loomed over him again. This time, there was no question. This was the end. There was no escape. There was no other side. Ethan was already part of the web, and the web was waiting. Chapter 7. The unraveling time no longer existed in any meaningful way. Every breath felt like a slow, deliberate suffocation, the weight of the unseen threads pushing down on him. And yet, the air was so still, so thick. Ethan had no concept of how long he had been here, or even where here was anymore. Was this a dream? A hellish limbo between life and death? Or was this place a part of him now, threaded into the very fabric of his soul? The voices had receded, leaving behind a thick silence, oppressive and all-consuming. The sound of his own heartbeat pounded in his ears, louder now, as though his very body was a fragile thing, about to burst under the pressure of this overwhelming weight. He raised his hand to his face, but it felt strange, alien. His fingers had grown stiff, cold to the touch, as though the very life had been leached from him. He blinked hard, trying to clear the fog in his mind, but the effort felt pointless. There was no escaping this suffocating fog, this web that had claimed him. His body was numb, his senses dulled. It was as if he was suspended in a dark, watery space, unable to move, unable to speak. But then, the ground shifted again. It was subtle, a slight trembling beneath his hands, but it was enough to make Ethan's pulse spike. He turned his head, searching the endless void, hoping for some sign of life, some movement, something. But the only movement was within him. The threads, the web. Ethan closed his eyes, a futile attempt to block out the encroaching horror. He could feel them, those invisible threads, like a network of unseen veins running beneath his skin. His every thought was now a reflection of them, his very mind woven into the fabric of the web. He couldn't think clearly. The thoughts were no longer his own. They were the thoughts of something far older, far more powerful. They whispered to him in a language he couldn't understand, a language of tangled thoughts and fractured realities. The voice that had once spoken to him, the chorus of voices, returned, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was louder, more urgent, like an order or a command. You are no longer separate. The words vibrated inside his skull, sending shivers down his spine. Ethan tried to shake his head, to clear the intrusive thoughts, but it was no use. The voices were inescapable, as if they were embedded into the very fibers of his being. He tried to move his legs, but his body felt as though it were trapped in some sort of binding, the threads pulling tighter with every attempted motion. You are no longer yourself. The words came like a storm, battering against him, overwhelming him, until all he could feel was the pressure. His chest tightened, as though something was constricting his heart, pulling it inward. The air was growing heavier with every breath he took, and he realized, with a sickening certainty, that it wasn't just the pressure of the web that was causing him to suffocate. It was the loss of his identity. Who was he now? Ethan. The name echoed faintly in his mind, but it felt distant, foreign. It was like trying to remember a dream from years ago, when the details had slipped through his fingers like grains of sand. He was no longer sure if he had ever truly been Ethan at all. Who am I? The question loomed in his mind, more pressing than anything. Was he still human? Was he still himself? Or had the threads of the web already unraveled him completely? His body jerked violently, as if responding to some unseen force. It felt like a gasp, a breath taken from him unwillingly, as if he were being drawn into something deeper. The ground beneath him was shifting again, the very air trembling with some kind of unseen energy. The walls of reality, once firm and unyielding, were no longer stable. They buckled and distorted, as though they were dissolving into some incomprehensible geometry. The air shimmered, bending and warping like liquid glass, and Ethan realized with a growing horror that this place, this nightmare, was not a place at all. It was a construct, a creation, a trap. The thought sank into his bones. There was no escaping it. He was part of this place now, as much a part of it as the threads that were woven into his mind. The web had consumed him, his thoughts, his consciousness, his very being. He was nothing more than a puppet caught in the strings of a dark cosmic force that had been waiting for him for so long. It's time. The voice was louder now, almost physical, the words vibrating in the air around him. Ethan felt the words like a force that pressed against his chest, suffocating him. The time had come for him to understand, to comprehend the full scope of what he had become a part of. The walls of reality shifted once more, and this time the shift was unmistakable. The ground beneath him opened, revealing an abyss, a chasm that stretched downward, endless and black. The air grew colder, and Ethan could feel it pulling him toward the edge of the void. His limbs were stiff, unwilling to obey, but his body was already moving, as though it were no longer under his control. The abyss called to him, its darkness so absolute, so consuming that it felt like the end of everything. The web, the threads, the voices, they all converged on this point. This was the heart of it all, the center of the web, the source. The voice spoke again, this time with an eerie calmness. Welcome to the end. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, but there was no fight left in him. His body, his soul, his very existence had been drawn into this place, and he was powerless to resist it. He could feel the threads of the web pulling at him, weaving themselves deeper into his mind, into his flesh. He was a part of the web now, just another strand in an infinite tapestry of existence. But where would it end? The chasm before him seemed to grow wider, darker, until it swallowed all the light in the room. Ethan took a step forward, and the ground beneath him gave way. He was falling, and as he fell into the darkness, the voices rose up around him, their chorus deafening, their words incomprehensible. He reached out, but there was nothing to grasp. No escape, no release, only the endless fall, only the web. Chapter 8. The boundless abyss. Ethan could feel it, deep within him. The darkness. It was everywhere, swallowing him whole with each passing moment. It had no shape, no form, only a deep, crushing presence that seemed to seep through the very fabric of his being. His limbs felt numb, though his mind screamed for clarity, for escape. But escape wasn't an option. Not anymore. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. As he fell, there was no ground beneath him, no ceiling above. There was only the black void that stretched infinitely in every direction. The air was thick, dense with the stench of decay and the heavy weight of something ancient, something malevolent. The sensation was suffocating, as though the abyss itself was slowly closing in on him, folding him into its unending depths. He had no sense of direction, no up, no down, only the feeling of falling, of spiraling deeper into the void that seemed to stretch out into eternity. His heart thudded in his chest, each beat louder than the last, the sound reverberating in the silence of the abyss. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps, yet no matter how fast he exhaled, the air felt thick in his lungs, as though it were choking him from the inside out. And the whispers, the voices that had been so distant, so faint, now filled the silence like a chorus of shadows, creeping through his mind like 1,000 tiny daggers. "You're too far gone now." The words slithered into his consciousness, but they weren't spoken aloud. No, they were something else, something far more insidious. They were thoughts, his own thoughts, distorted and twisted into something foreign. The voices had become part of him, part of the fabric of his mind. He couldn't tell where they ended and he began. "You can't escape the web." Ethan's chest tightened, his breaths coming faster now. He tried to reach for something, anything to hold on to. His arms flailed in the nothingness, but there was nothing to grasp. No solid surface, no way to stop himself from falling. It was as if his very existence was dissolving into this abyss. And then something began to shift. At first it was so subtle he almost missed it, a small ripple in the air, like the faintest tremor beneath the surface of the void. But as the ripple spread, it grew stronger, more intense. A coldness seeped into him, an ice-cold tendril that wrapped around his chest, squeezing tighter and tighter. The threads that had once been invisible to him now tightened around his heart, pulling him deeper into this nightmare. His thoughts became jumbled, like a puzzle he couldn't piece together. He tried to focus, tried to make sense of it all, but the harder he tried, the more fragmented everything became. Reality was slipping away, unraveling before him. "Welcome to the core." The voice, so familiar now, spoke again, this time with a dark glee that chilled him to his core. Ethan tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the endless darkness. His mind was overwhelmed, his sense of self fading with every passing second. Then, a flash of light. It was fleeting, like a star blinking into existence for a brief moment, before disappearing into the blackness. But in that flash, Ethan saw something, a figure, a shape. It was almost human, but not quite. The figure stood motionless in the distance, its silhouette barely visible against the endless void. The figure was hunched, its form twisted, as though it had been shaped by some unknown force. And there, in the depths of the void, its eyes, glowed with an unnatural light. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "Do you see it?" the voice whispered. "Do you see the truth now?" He wanted to look away, to close his eyes and block it out, but he couldn't. His body refused to obey him, paralyzed by some unseen force. As the figure drew nearer, its glowing eyes fixed on him. With each passing second, it seemed to grow larger, more terrifying, until it was all he could see. It was coming for him. The air around Ethan crackled with energy as the figure advanced. The ripples in the void became waves, and the very fabric of the abyss seemed to tremble. Ethan's pulse quickened. His skin prickled. The threads that had once been subtle now dug deep into his flesh, twisting him, pulling him closer toward the figure. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but there was no escape, no refuge. The figure reached out toward him with hands that seemed to stretch and distort unnaturally, like dark tendrils reaching from the depths of the void. They were cold, colder than anything Ethan had ever felt before. He could feel them creeping closer, their touch like ice against his skin. They wrapped around his arms, his chest, his neck, suffocating him. He tried to pull away, but it was no use. The darkness was consuming him, pulling him further into its embrace. You were always meant to be a part of this. The voice spoke again, but it no longer felt like a whisper. It was a roar, a deafening sound that shattered his mind, overwhelming him with its power. Ethan could feel his body convulsing, his mind slipping further away as the tendrils of darkness pulled him into the figure's embrace. It wasn't real. None of this was real. The thought flickered in his mind, but it was fleeting, drowned out by the overwhelming presence of the figure. There was no escape, no way out. The threads had him now, and they were not letting go. His vision blurred as the figure loomed over him, its face a grotesque mask of darkness, its glowing eyes now inches from his own. Ethan could feel its breath, cold, foul, ancient, on his face, as if the creature itself were a living nightmare, a manifestation of his deepest fears. And then, in that moment of pure terror, everything went black. Chapter 9. The Unraveling. The light, small, fleeting, yet undeniable, grew stronger, its warmth pulsing in rhythm with Ethan's frantic heartbeat. His entire body ached as the tendrils of the abyss coiled tighter around him, as though the darkness were trying to force him back, to smother the spark of hope that now burned inside him. The voice, the creature's voice, roared in fury, its venomous hiss like nails scraping against glass. "You think you can escape?" The voice spat, each word dripping with malice. "You cannot outrun your fate, Ethan. You are ours." But Ethan's will, though battered and broken, was not yet entirely consumed by the abyss. The light flickered again, brighter this time, and with it came a surge of power unlike anything he had ever felt. It wasn't just warmth or comfort, it was force. It was an undeniable current, a tide that pulled him away from the suffocating darkness. His vision blurred as his body trembled, every nerve on fire. The tendrils around his body tightened further, constricting his ribs, making it hard to breathe, to think. The cold fingers of the void scraped against his skin, but through the excruciating pain, he clung to that light. He focused on it, determined not to let the darkness swallow him whole. "You cannot resist me forever, Ethan." The voice was growing more frantic now, desperate. It had been certain of its victory, but now it faltered, sensing a shift. "You will succumb. The web is eternal." But even as it spoke, Ethan's soul rebelled. The energy within him surged like a tidal wave, a force that didn't belong to the void. It was his will, his strength, something the darkness had never anticipated. The realization hit him with the force of a thunderclap. He was not just a victim. He was part of the web, yes, but he could also tear at the threads that bound him. He could become more than just the thing that had been ensnared. He could unravel it. He closed his eyes, forcing his thoughts into focus, pulling every ounce of strength he could muster into the light. "I won't be a part of this," he thought fiercely. "I refuse." And as his mind sharpened, the darkness began to retreat, if only for a moment. The tendrils loosened their grip, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Ethan was able to breathe. The oppressive weight of the void lightened, and the distant light pulsed more brightly, like a beacon guiding him forward. But the creature was not ready to surrender. It was ancient, beyond comprehension, and its fury was boundless. Ethan could feel it now, its hunger, its rage, vibrating through the air around him. It was twisting, churning, its presence pressing against him with crushing force, determined to drag him back into the eternal dark. "You cannot break me," the creature snarled, its voice now a low growl. "I am the keeper of the web. You are mine. You will always be mine." The light flickered once again, brighter this time, as though reacting to the creature's words. It was as though it was fighting the void, and in that moment, Ethan understood. The light wasn't just a beacon. It was alive too. It had a will, a purpose, something that the darkness had never been prepared for. Ethan opened his eyes and saw it. The threads of the web, stretching out around him like spider silk, glowing faintly, tethering him to this place. Each thread vibrated with the pulse of the creature, yet there was something else, something weakening. The web wasn't as invincible as the creature had made it seem. "What are you?" Ethan whispered, his voice trembling but firm. The light pulsed in response, and for the first time he felt a flicker of understanding. It wasn't just trying to save him, it was trying to show him the way out. The light knew how to tear through the darkness. It knew how to unravel the very threads of the web. Ethan's hand reached out toward it, his fingers trembling, and for a moment, the threads of the web seemed to loosen. But just as his fingers brushed against the light, the creature's roar of fury shook the very fabric of the void. The tendrils around him snapped like whips, crashing into his body with brutal force, sending shockwaves of pain through his chest. His vision blurred again, his breath ragged, but he held on. "You will never escape," the creature hissed. "You are mine, Ethan. You belong to the void." But Ethan's mind was no longer his own. It was a battlefield, a storm of emotions and thoughts, fueled by the pulsing light that now consumed him. The light wrapped around his soul, comforting him, pushing him forward. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was something else, something more powerful, something that could defy the abyss. "I will not bow to you." Ethan's voice rang out with a strength he didn't know he had. His words echoed through the void like a bell, ringing with clarity and defiance. The creature recoiled for the briefest of moments, its presence faltering as though the very act of defiance had thrown it off balance. And in that instant of vulnerability, the light surged forward like a wave crashing onto the shore, tearing through the darkness. The tendrils snapped. The threads of the web began to unravel. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline of the moment coursing through him. The power of the light burned brighter, and he could feel the darkness around him weakening, retreating like shadows before the dawn. The creature's voice grew frantic, its desperation echoing in his ears. "No, you cannot!" But it was too late. The web trembled, its threads snapping like brittle twine, disintegrating into nothingness. The creature howled in pain, its form beginning to disintegrate, its presence breaking apart, scattered into the wind. It had never known true resistance, never believed that someone could break free from the web it had woven so carefully for centuries. And now, its grip on Ethan was slipping away. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan felt free. The air around him was lighter, the oppressive weight of the void fading, replaced by the brilliance of the light that surrounded him like a protective cocoon. The darkness was dissipating, its power retreating into the corners from which it had come. Ethan's body was still trembling, his mind reeling from the sheer intensity of the struggle. But he was no longer shackled. He was no longer a victim. He was something else, something that the web had never anticipated. The void was silent now. There was nothing left but the soft, steady pulse of the light. Ethan's eyes fluttered closed as exhaustion finally overcame him, his body aching, but a profound sense of peace settling over him. He had won. But as his consciousness began to fade, he felt a chill, a coldness so deep that it sent a shiver down his spine. It was a whisper, faint but unmistakable. "This is not the end." Ethan's consciousness wavered as he slipped into a state of limbo, neither fully awake nor fully asleep. His body, exhausted from the battle with the dark forces, hung suspended between worlds, and the fleeting sensation of light's warmth was the only thing that tethered him to reality. This is not the end. The whisper had come from somewhere deep inside him. At first, it had been a murmur, a soft echo that he couldn't quite place. But now it was clearer, louder, almost like a voice from within, one that was as ancient as the web itself. His thoughts scrambled to make sense of it, but the darkness around him was beginning to take shape once again. The light he had felt, the one that had surged and pushed the web to its breaking point, was now a faint, fragile glow. It pulsed irregularly, its strength waning. And then, the shadows returned. They began as whispers at the edge of his awareness, tendrils curling like smoke, stretching into his consciousness. He could feel them. They were pulling, curling, tugging at his very soul, trying to reel him back into their grasp. The web was far from gone, and the force that had kept him trapped here was still alive, still hungry. "You cannot escape the web." The voice from the void spoke again, though this time it was not the same tone of fury. It was almost regretful. "You have merely delayed the inevitable, Ethan." He opened his eyes, or at least he thought he did. It was hard to tell where he was anymore. His surroundings were indistinct, a dark, shifting void where the very air seemed to vibrate with unseen movement. It was as though the fabric of reality itself had been torn, leaving only the remnants of a world he could no longer comprehend. But even in the darkness he could feel it, the pulsing light, now a distant beacon in the fog. It wasn't gone. It had simply retreated, leaving him in a sort of suspended state, a liminal space between his old life and whatever was now to come. He reached out, his arms trembling, his fingers brushing against the thick, dark air. Something within him stirred, desperate to find the light again, to pull himself from the suffocating grip of the shadows. But as his hand moved, the shadows responded. They swirled around him, tightening, slithering against his skin like the cold touch of 1,000 unseen hands. The tendrils of the web had not been destroyed. They had simply been dormant, waiting for him to lower his guard. "I will make you one with the void," the voice intoned, its tone dark and final. "You are already a part of this. You always have been." The words felt like chains wrapping around his chest, and for a moment he believed them. His breath hitched in his throat, the pressure mounting, and the light flickered again, weaker than before. For a moment, he thought he might sink into the abyss, surrender to the inevitable. But then, he remembered the surge of power he had felt earlier, the surge that had allowed him to push back, if only for a brief moment. He could feel it now, deep inside him, like a spark waiting to ignite. His thoughts, though clouded and heavy, began to clear. There was something inside him, something born from the web but also outside of it, something that didn't belong to the void. "I refuse," Ethan whispered, his voice hoarse but growing stronger with each word. "I will not be part of this." The light surged once again, this time more intense, more focused. It wasn't just an outside force trying to protect him. It was his will, his strength, amplified by the very web that sought to devour him. He could feel the power rising from within, and with it came the realization that the web, though vast and unrelenting, was not invincible. The very nature of the darkness, the very structure of the web itself was fragile. It had been woven together over eons, but its foundation was built on fear and manipulation, not strength. "You think you can fight me?" The voice now screamed, a cacophony of rage and terror. "You are nothing. You are a speck, a moment in time. You cannot break the web. You cannot defeat me." The darkness began to close in, its tendrils tightening around his body once again, this time with more force, as though it was trying to smother the very life out of him. But Ethan didn't fight it the way he had before. He didn't try to push it away. Instead, he let it come. He let the dark threads coil around him, knowing that this time they wouldn't hold. With every passing moment, the web grew weaker. He could feel it, the pulsing of the threads, their resistance fading, unraveling. And with each thread that snapped, he grew stronger. "No." The voice was no longer confident, no longer the force that had once dominated everything around him. "You cannot. You will not." But it was too late. The web was coming apart. The light inside him, his light, was stronger than anything the creature had ever known. The more he embraced it, the more the darkness recoiled. The tendrils that had once been so suffocating now shriveled, their cold grip weakening as though they were burning away under the heat of his resolve. The creature, too, was beginning to fade. Its voice, once so terrifying, was now just a hollow echo, a whisper carried away by the wind. It was dying. The thing that had fed on fear, that had woven its grip around him for so long, was finally being undone. Ethan could feel the darkness crumble around him, collapsing in on itself like a house of cards. And as the last of the shadows began to dissipate, a great silence fell. For a long moment, Ethan didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply existed in the space between worlds, surrounded by nothing but the soft, steady hum of the light. It was over. The web had unraveled. The creature was gone. But even in that silence, Ethan could still hear the faintest whisper, a faint echo from the depths of the void. This is not the end. It wasn't the voice of the creature. It wasn't the web. It was something else entirely. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he realized what he had just done. He had broken the web, yes, but in doing so, he had opened a door to something far darker, far more dangerous than anything he had ever faced, and he was standing on the edge of it now. Chapter 10. The Final Thread. Ethan stood in the silence, his breath shallow, his chest heaving as the remnants of the void collapsed around him. The web was gone, or at least it appeared to be. But the unease that gnawed at his mind refused to let him embrace the stillness fully. There was something left, something beyond the creature he had faced, beyond the dark threads that had once bound him. It was as though the darkness had been merely a prelude to something more dreadful, something far older. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure if he had truly escaped or if he had simply fallen into another trap, one more insidious and far-reaching than the last. The air around him was unnaturally still, as though the very atmosphere had been drained of its life, leaving only a sense of desolation. The light, too, though bright and comforting in its presence, flickered erratically, like a dying flame fighting against an overwhelming wind. And then from the silence came the whisper again. "This is not the end." The voice was unmistakable. It wasn't the entity he had defeated, nor was it the web. This was something else, something ancient. Ethan could feel it now, the chill creeping up his spine, the pulse of something sinister just out of reach. His heart pounded louder now, reverberating in the otherwise dead air. He looked around, but there was nothing to see. Only the endless empty darkness that stretched out like a void, consuming everything in its path. The familiar surroundings of his home, the world he had known, were gone. It was as if the fabric of reality had been torn and replaced with this desolate space, one where time itself felt like a mere illusion. Suddenly the silence shattered, replaced by a soft rustling sound that seemed to echo from all directions. The ground beneath his feet trembled, subtle at first, like the stirrings of a distant storm. But it grew louder, more insistent. The shadows, once so still, began to shift, slithering and coiling like living serpents. Ethan took a step back, but the darkness seemed to move with him, growing thicker, more oppressive. "You cannot escape this fate," the voice whispered again, this time clearer, more forceful. "You are already part of the thread, and the thread never breaks." The ground shook harder now, and Ethan's knees nearly buckled under the force of it. He glanced down, and for the first time he noticed it. A single thread, delicate but unyielding, snaking its way through the fabric of the air, glowing faintly in the oppressive dark. The thread was thin, so thin it seemed almost fragile, but there was no mistaking what it was. It pulsed with an unnatural energy, and as he looked closer, he realized that it wasn't just a single thread. It stretched out, spreading infinitely in every direction, weaving itself into the very essence of this place. Ethan's mind raced. He had broken the web, had defeated the entity that had sought to control him. Yet now he was confronted with this strange, inescapable thread that seemed to tie him to everything. He could feel it pulling at him, tugging at his consciousness, like a connection to something far beyond his understanding. "This thread is your undoing," the voice continued, colder now, more certain. "It is the root of everything. You will never sever it. You will never escape it." Ethan clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. No, he wasn't going to give in again. He had come this far, had fought through the darkness, and he would not let this final threat break him. With a deep breath, he reached for the thread. It was warm to the touch, but as his fingers made contact with it, a searing pain shot through his hand. He recoiled instinctively, but the pain didn't subside. It spread, shooting up his arm, wrapping around his chest like burning chains. It felt as though the thread was alive, feeding on his strength, draining his very essence. "You are nothing," the voice hissed. "You are merely a vessel, a pawn in this endless game. And this thread, it is your destiny." Ethan's vision blurred as the pain intensified, each heartbeat a violent thud against his chest. His skin burned as though it was being torn apart from the inside. His mind spun with thoughts of surrender, of giving in to the inevitability of it all. How could he fight something so eternal? How could he possibly defeat a force that had been woven into the very fabric of existence? But in the midst of the pain, a memory surfaced, a flicker of light, a whisper of hope. It was the moment he had pushed back the creature, the moment he had felt the surge of power within him. That power hadn't come from the web. It hadn't come from the darkness. It had come from him, from his will, from his defiance. His heart surged, the light inside him flickering back to life, burning brighter than before. He had already survived the darkness once. He could do it again. He had to. With a primal roar, Ethan forced his hand back toward the thread, this time not to grasp it, but to tear it apart. The pain exploded through him, but he didn't falter. He was not going to be controlled. He was not going to be trapped in this endless cycle. And then, something shifted. The thread, once so firm, began to unravel beneath his touch. Slowly at first, but then faster, quicker, as though the very fabric of the dark space was being ripped apart. The voice screamed in fury, a raw guttural sound that shook the very air, but it was fading now, weaker with each passing moment. The thread was coming apart. The connections that had once bound him to this nightmare were snapping, unraveling like broken strings. Ethan didn't stop. He kept pulling, tearing, unraveling the thread until the space around him trembled, then cracked, and then collapsed. The darkness that had surrounded him, that had suffocated him, began to fade, its oppressive grip slipping away like dust in the wind. For a brief, blissful moment, Ethan felt nothing but silence. And then, just as suddenly, the silence was shattered once again. But this time, it wasn't the voice of the web. It wasn't the dark entity from before. It was the sound of his own breath, steady and slow. The thrum of his own heartbeat. Ethan opened his eyes. He was lying on the ground, his body aching as though he had been stretched to the very limits of endurance. His hands were raw, and his chest burned with the memory of the pain he had endured. But when he looked around, he found that the darkness was gone. He was back in his apartment. The walls were intact, the room was as it should be. And yet, something had changed. He could feel it. The light, though brighter, still flickered. The shadows were not entirely gone. They lingered at the edges of his vision, shifting, waiting. Ethan's pulse quickened, his breath catching in his throat. The web had unraveled, the entity had been defeated. But the final thread had not been fully severed. It was still there, stretching into his world. And no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, he could feel it pulling at him again. And deep inside, he knew. It was not over. Chapter 10. The final thread continued. Ethan sat on the floor, his hands trembling from the raw energy he had just expended. His mind was a storm of conflicting thoughts, relief, confusion, and dread. He had escaped the dark void, freed himself from the clutches of the malevolent thread that had bound him for so long. Yet, despite the sense of victory that should have flooded his chest, an unsettling sensation lingered. It was as if a piece of him had been left behind in the darkness, a part that would never truly return. He rose shakily, his body aching in places he hadn't even known existed. His breath was ragged, as though he had been running for hours, but the silence in the room was absolute. The city outside his window was as still as it always had been. There were no signs of the nightmare he had just endured, no distorted, shadowy shapes in the corner of his vision, no whispering voices curling their way through his thoughts. But there was a pressure, too subtle to touch, but too intense to ignore. It pressed against the back of his skull, against his very mind, as though something was lurking just beyond the edges of his perception. He felt the pull again, soft at first, like the tug of an invisible thread wrapped around his consciousness. The eerie feeling that had gnawed at him before returned with a vengeance, and his gaze snapped toward the corners of the room. The shadows shifted, almost imperceptibly, as though they were aware of his awareness. Was he still trapped? No, this time he would not be deceived. He had defeated the web. The dark entity had fallen. The physical realm was his again. He had fought, and he had won. But in his chest, where the tension had once been unbearable, there was now something colder, a deeper uncertainty, as if he were being watched from within the very walls. The thread may have unraveled in the void, but the remnants of it had clearly followed him. He reached for the lamp beside him, the light flickering as if it too was on the verge of breaking. He needed to find the last shred of whatever was left, to understand how far the darkness could reach, and how far it was willing to go to reclaim him. Ethan stumbled to the window, part of him hoping that seeing the city again would remind him of his life, of the reality he thought he had escaped to. The skyline stretched before him, the city streets winding with their usual ebb and flow of life. People walked, cars honked. Life continued without a single hint of what he had endured. Was any of it real? He pushed that thought aside quickly. The physical world was tangible, undeniable, but the threads, the whispers, the web, it had felt real. Every touch, every sensation, the pressure that had built in his mind, the panic that had gripped his heart. Those were not mere hallucinations. They were signs of something far more insidious. Ethan turned his back to the window and faced the room once again. It seemed unchanged, but something was different. There was a shift in the air, a slight hum in the atmosphere, like the last breath of something ancient, something that had witnessed the fall of countless others before him. He felt his pulse quicken, the hairs on the back of his neck standing at attention. Then, as if by instinct, his eyes were drawn to the mirror on the far wall. At first he saw nothing, just his own reflection, standing there, a broken man, his expression worn and weary from the battle he had fought. But as his gaze lingered, he noticed something that made his breath catch in his throat. In the mirror, the image of his face began to distort. His features blurred, stretching, becoming something other, something dark. It was as though the reflection was no longer his own, but something else entirely, something older, something malevolent. The image flickered, then twisted, and just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. He blinked, his heart thundering in his chest. Ethan rushed toward the mirror, his reflection now appearing as it should. His face, pale and marked by exhaustion, was once again his own. But the unsettling feeling lingered. He knew he had seen it. It was still here. He backed away slowly, his eyes glued to the mirror as if it could reveal the truth he was so desperate to understand. The web, the thread, had followed him. Yes, that was clear. But the question remained. Why? Why had the darkness not relented? Why did it still seek him, even after everything? There was a sudden sound behind him, a soft creaking, as though something, or someone, was moving through the room. He spun around, but no one was there. The air was thick with the absence of presence, but Ethan could feel it now. The pull, the subtle pressure at the edges of his mind, almost imperceptible but growing stronger with each passing second. Then, as if to answer the question he hadn't spoken aloud, the voice returned. "You cannot escape what is yours." The words echoed through the room, twisting, weaving through the very air, curling into his ears like a tangible thing. He turned again toward the window, as if the city could somehow offer him solace, but the view before him had changed. The skyline was no longer familiar. The buildings, the streets, they were all warped, distorted, like a nightmarish reflection of the world he knew. The lights were dim, casting long shadows that stretched unnaturally across the ground. The distant sound of cars was replaced by a low, droning hum, and the air was thick with something he could not name. Ethan staggered back from the window, a cold sweat beading on his forehead. His heart raced again, the panic surging up his throat like bile. This was not his world. It couldn't be. He turned to look at the mirror once more, but this time, something was different. The reflection was not just twisted. It was empty. There was no face staring back at him, only a dark void, an endless abyss that seemed to stretch into infinity. And in the center of that abyss, a single thread of darkness reached out toward him. It was the same thread, the one he had felt pulling at him earlier, but now it was no longer a distant force. Now it was in front of him, in the mirror, reaching. Without thinking, Ethan leaped forward, grabbing at the edge of the mirror and pulling with all his strength. The glass groaned under the pressure, but it held firm, and then, as if to mock his efforts, the thread snapped back violently, yanking him toward it. He stumbled, his mind spinning, but as he tried to free himself from the mirror's hold, he felt his own body begin to shift, his very form warping, bending, pulling toward the thread. "You are part of the web," the voice whispered again, now not from the mirror, but from within him, as though it had always been there. lying dormant, waiting to be awakened. And then the reflection smiled. The face in the glass twisted into a grotesque grin, an expression that had no place in the world Ethan knew. You belong to it now. The thread binds all. The room began to spin, the walls warping and stretching, the floor tilting as though the very reality around him was being undone. Ethan could feel himself being pulled apart, his body, his soul, his very existence drawn into the void of the mirror. And in that moment, he understood. This was not the end. This was only the beginning.